Hello, my name is Jonathan Lyne and I'm a Program Manager in Microsoft's Identity Engineering team, which is responsible for Azure Active Directory, B2C and Microsoft accounts. In this video, I'm going to talk about the developer journey for integrating your application with Azure Active Directory. Before we get into the journey, I want to start by taking a step back and providing context why identity is so important in today's world. In years past, it was a simpler time. An employee or a user had a single device, accessing a few apps that were on premises or within a network perimeter. But the world is a much more complicated place now. There's a host of apps, devices and services that people are using every day, and they are collaborating among more people, be it with other co-workers, customers or partners. And more, the data is being stored in the cloud, and users are accessing these apps and data on multiple devices, either their own personal device or a device given by their employer. This ends up, as you can see, with a complicated matrix of possible scenarios that we need to allow our users to do, and of course protect against. One thing that we can bind and secure these disparate items together is cloud identity, like Microsoft has with Azure Active Directory and Microsoft personal accounts. We see identity as the control plane, and Gartner suggests that by 2021, identity as a service will be the majority access model. So identity has really become the hub to manage this chaos. As organizations and their employees are moving to the cloud, the security strategy needs to start with a strong, protected single identity at the center of their business. Having a strong identity and access strategy is crucial for balancing security and productivity. So for us, identity is the new control plane. It safeguards your core assets, whether they're on-prem or in the cloud. There are 5 main benefits of using the Microsoft Identity Platform. Firstly, reduce sign-in friction for both you as an ISV developer and for your customers. By no longer managing identities and authentication within your application, you will save time and can focus your effort on your core product. You'll also lower the cost of development. There's no more building infrastructure to store those usernames and passwords. Your users will have a better user experience. Allowing users to use their preferred identity to sign into their applications is what they're after. You can also enhance the security of your application. How many of you that have apps where you store usernames and passwords have had your customers ask for multi-factor authentication, or have your customers ask or make requirements around security and how your app is secured? You and your customers will be able to leverage a suite of security capabilities, which I'll mention later on in this video. You'll also be able to leverage the Microsoft Cloud of your application. And what I mean by that is you'll be able to use our Microsoft Graph API to integrate and leverage Office 365 capabilities from within your application on behalf of your users. So your users can use their Office 365 tenant integrated with your application to do a number of activities. You'll also be able to comply with your customers' IT. You'll be able to reassure your customers' IT pros or security specialists that your app is safe and secure. And of course, we come to integration. And during this session, I'll talk about the wealth of resources that makes integration into the Microsoft Identity Platform easy. This is the one salesy slide I promise. And I won't go through each of these numbers, but it's safe to say we have a lot of customers, which means there's a very good chance your customers are already using Azure AD. So let me put these impressive numbers into a bit of context. Everyone that uses Office 365 has Azure Active Directory. Everyone that uses Azure has Azure Active Directory. So what if your customers don't use either of those platforms? Well, we have large numbers of Amazon Web Services and Google's G Suite platforms using Azure Active Directory as their identity provider, and there's literally thousands of applications that already are integrated into Azure Active Directory, and your customers will be using and leveraging those with their identity. So when you build apps with Azure Active Directory, you get to easily reach users at scale. With Azure Active Directory, we have the world's #1 enterprise identity system. But what if my customers don't use Azure Active Directory? That's a question I often get asked. Well, they will have an on-premises Active Directory. So the IT pro in your customer can simply install the Azure AD Connect agent on one of their servers. This will then collect the identity and group data from their domain controller and synchronize those to an Azure Active Directory tenant. The IT pro can choose a number of options, including to sync passwords for same sign-on or pass-through authentication for single sign-on. Users now have a single sign-on situation enabled to any application using Azure Active Directory, including yours. This means using the same credentials they are using to log on to their PC and on-premise apps to access cloud applications. And importantly, it's free. There's no cost to you, and there's no cost unless your customer wants some of the premium features for them. So it's a very, very easy way for anybody to start leveraging Azure Active Directory. So the vast majority of your customers would most likely have it in place, but if they don't, it's not a problem. They can simply start consuming it and get that rich single sign-on experience. So let's look at how your app can be integrated into Azure AD. Our platform supports open standards, so if you have an existing application that's already using SAML or OAuth, it's straightforward to connect your application with very little changes. If you're building new, then we recommend OpenID as it's the latest standard and provides a simpler model for authentication, easier for customers to onboard, and easier to integrate with the Microsoft Graph. But of course, the choice is yours. With our Microsoft Authentication libraries, often referred to as MSAL, we've made adding authentication into your apps easy. We provide documentation, reference code, samples, and walkthroughs for a wide range of languages. So no matter what your application is built on, you should be able to get integration into Azure AD up and running. So now we've got single sign-on for your application. So why did we do this? Well, there are a number of advantages. One identity, and your customers will love you for this one. 2, sign in with known AD or Azure AD Office 365 accounts, so they're not having to have a new set of credentials. You also don't need to manage those credentials. Enhanced security, removing the need to build and maintain authentication solution for your application. Your customer can delegate user and access management. You can integrate into the M365, O365 platforms using the Microsoft Graph API. And as I'll show you in a bit, make your app easier to discover by your customers. So once we have your app working with Azure Active Directory using OAuth or SAML, you can apply for the application to be added to the Azure AD App Gallery. Other than using OAuth or SAML, the only other requirement is that your application needs to be SaaS, multi-tenanted. So what is the Azure AD App Gallery? Well, it's a store where ISVs can publish their applications for integration with Azure AD, allowing their customers to not only find the application, but be able to onboard the application into their organization. The gallery delivers a trusted location for customers to consent access to these third-party applications, such as yours. And finally, the gallery enables ISVs to allow their customers to use Azure AD accounts to log into their SaaS applications and solutions. So once you've listed your application in the gallery, it can be discovered across several surface areas. IT admins can discover your application within the Azure portal. This can help IT admins easily deploy your application across the company or for specific users and groups. As a developer, you will no longer need to get access to the customer's environment or tenant to set up your application. Once the IT Pro has added your app from the gallery, they will be presented with some simple steps to run through and get the application available to their users. In fact, there is only one required step, which is turn on single sign-on. The others are optional, but your customers will want to use them. Firstly, they can assign users and groups that they want to access the application, so they can define the user pool from their organization. They can enable the security controls they require using conditional access. For example, turning on MFA when using the application outside of the office or on a non-corporate owned device. They can also turn on self-service, allowing their users to request access to the application and enable workflow to govern that. And finally, provisioning. I'll talk about this in a bit more detail later on, but this allows them to send identity information to your application as and when it changes if your application needs user data, perhaps for licensing or profiling. The IT Pro could log into your app and see the users they defined so they could assign licenses or roles within the application that is required as part of your authorization model. If you're using SAML as opposed to OAuth or OpenID, you will most likely be familiar with the exchange of URIs and signing certificates. Again, we have made this process easier for your customers. Using our API, you can provide a one-click SSO button to automate that process. The one-click SSO feature is designed to configure single sign-on for apps that support the SAML protocol. On the Azure AD single sign-on configuration page, this option allows you to automatically configure the Azure AD metadata on the application side. In this way, you can quickly set up single sign-on with minimal manual effort. So let's run through that scenario with DocuSign. So firstly, let's click Set up DocuSign, which brings me to the DocuSign admin portal. I click Yes. On the DocuSign portal, in the Setup Single Sign-On window, I click Yes to let the Azure AD auto-populate the fields for me. All I have to do now is click OK to save the changes. It is that easy. And now we're back into the Azure portal. Publisher verification is a new capability for ISVs and developers. When you register your app into Azure AD, you can now add your Microsoft Partner Network ID. So we can run some checks and verify your application. This provides increased customer trust and transparency for your application. So when they go to add your application and consent to the permissions it requires, they can see that the application is verified. IT pros can now allow end-user consent to applications that have only been publisher verified, providing an extra layer of security. So this is a key activity to do. As more and more organizations are going to be moving towards a deployment where they'll only allow consent for verified applications, and it only takes a matter of minutes to complete. Once your application has been onboarded by the IT Pro within your customer's organization, their users can discover the app on the Office 365 App Launcher, the Office 365 App Gallery, the Microsoft My Apps, and within Microsoft Search on Office.com. So it's easy for IT to be able to quickly provision your application and get it across all their users. Customers have security as one of their priorities. I'm sure each of you have had customer conversation where they've said your app needs to support MFA, and then you're working out how you can build that into your identity solution or whether you need to purchase a third-party product to do it. So why build or buy these capabilities for your application? The answer is you shouldn't have to. When you integrate and build with our identity platform, you're able to protect your application and users more effectively by allowing your customers to leverage capabilities within their Azure Active Directory. So what do I mean by this? Well, when your customers sign in with their Azure AD account, they get the security benefits and access controls they know and are already using. They can extend their Azure AD security benefits to your application. So instead of adding code to your app that enables MFA, conditional access or other advanced security features within our identity platform can provide these to your end customers on your behalf. It can help your application comply with IT policies they have in place. And when we talk to enterprise customers and enterprise IT, they want and need applications that comply with their company's IT policies. The first way we can secure the application with Azure Active Directory is with secure authentication methods. To start with, they can use MFA using the Authenticator apps, SMS or voice call. MFA can prevent 99.9% of identity attacks. Secondly, they can use passwordless authentication. Passwords are your biggest vulnerability, partly because they are the target of most attacks we see today. 81% of all attacks that were the result of weak or compromised credentials. But there is hope. Your customers can utilize passwordless using Windows Hello, part of Windows 10, using biometrics such as facial recognition or fingerprint. They can use the Microsoft Authenticator app to do passwordless. Or they can use a FIDO security key, like the YubiKey in the picture. And these features allow them to authenticate to your application without ever entering any credentials. Thirdly, we also continue to innovate around cloud-powered solutions like Azure AD password protection to help you secure user credentials. It may come as no surprise that users reuse passwords, or worse, set standard passwords all the time. Bad news? The hackers know this too, and according to our data, exploit this vulnerability all the time. With Azure AD password protection, we help enterprise identities in two ways. Banning common passwords that we see all the time at our end, and also gives them the ability to define a custom banned password list. And second is Smart Lockout, which gives enterprises the ability to define policies around how many times a wrong password can be entered before locking the user out. Conditional access is our way to help customers implement a zero trust security strategy. Conditional access is an intelligent policy that allows your customers to define conditions for how users authenticate and gain access to apps and data. It allows your customers to have a trust nothing, verify everything approach. With conditional access, your customers can now use criteria including users, the who, device and client application, the how, location, the where, and based on those, make a decision how they can access the workload / app that they want. So let's look at a quick example. When your customer uses your app in the office on a domain joined device, that's fine. When they use a domain joined device at home, they want to trigger MFA to make sure the user is who they say they are. When they use a personal device in a coffee shop on public available Wi-Fi, they might want to block access altogether. Conditional access allows you to build these granular controls and take into account those scenarios and implement the right controls based on those conditions. So Azure AD conditional access enables you to take into account for every sign-in the user, location, device, app, risk, and data before allowing access. Not all parameters are equal all the time, but you definitely want the flexibility to have this level of control. The key thing here is that your customer can define the controls they want or are required to implement if they're in a regulated industry. So they can bring your app into their security ecosystem as opposed to you having to try and bring security controls into your application. So right now you probably manage your customer's identity within your application. So how do you get that data into your application? We typically see ISVs getting their customers' identity data from file imports, manual scripts they've created, or in-house built automated solutions. However, most solutions we see are a manual process. By now I've hopefully convinced you that you don't want to create and manage your customers' identities for your application. However, you might want user data in your application, and this could be for a number of reasons such as licensing, onboarding, profiling, part of your authorization model. With Azure Active Directory, we support SCIM. SCIM is the system for cross-domain identity management and is an industry standard for automating the exchange of user identity information. Using SCIM, you can deploy a REST SCIM endpoint within your application that Azure Active Directory will send user and group data to in JSON format. You can then do whatever you want with that data. For example, store it in a database. And as changes to the users in their source tenant happen, those changes will be received by your endpoint as an update. For outbound provisioning with SCIM, we provide reference code and a sample endpoint so you can build and test provisioning. Once you're ready, using the same gallery submission form I talked about earlier, you can request us to work with you on enabling provisioning for your application. This brings us to the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph allows your application to integrate and leverage capabilities and data within your customers' Azure, Microsoft or Office 365 environments. With the Graph API, you can build custom solutions which both leverage all your customers' organization's data directly from the source, as well as create a personalized experience directly in the flow of your users' work. You can build any kind of application on top of Graph. Some examples include web and device native applications, but also bots and all kinds of new application types that are popping up, all the way to background processes and daemon services that run business workflows behind the scenes. It's best to think of the Microsoft Graph as an API gateway that unifies the many REST API offerings Microsoft has as a company. Today, the Microsoft Graph brings together more than 25 incredibly important APIs, including Azure Active Directory, productivity APIs like Exchange and OneDrive, security and management APIs like Intune and the Security Graph, Windows APIs like Roam and CloudPrint, and much, much more. For your app to access data in the Microsoft Graph, the user or administrator in your customer's environment must grant it the correct permissions via a consent process. When you register your application in Azure Active Directory, you specify the permissions and context you will need. When the user or IT pro authenticates your application for the first time, they will be presented a consent form showing the permissions your application is requesting and details of what that means. Some permissions, such as read your profile, can be accepted by the user. Other permissions need to be approved by an IT pro. And in this context, an IT pro has global admin or security admin permissions within the organization. The IT pro will also be given an option to accept permissions on behalf of the all organization, so no one else will see this prompt when they authenticate to the application. If your application requires admin approval, it's recommended that as part of your onboarding instructions, you get an IT pro from the customer to be the first user to log into your application so they can approve those permissions on behalf of the organisation. Alternatively, an IT pro can also go into the Azure portal and pre-approve the permissions for your application. When it comes to integrating with the Microsoft Graph, we have a great tool called the Graph Explorer. You can either use a pre-configured demo tenant or sign into your own Office 365 tenant or demo tenant, and you can then experiment with the Graph Explorer to see the types of data, insights and actions you can get your application to integrate with in Office 365. This is a great playground to see how you could leverage the Graph API for your application. So what I've taken you through today is the steps that a developer needs to go through at a high level to onboard their application into Azure Active Directory. We've talked about supporting single sign-on with your method of choice, whether that's OpenID, SAML. Talked about building a SCIM endpoint so you can provide and support automated provisioning for your customers. Mentioned the new publisher verification, so ensuring that your app is identified as being a verified application. Ensure you submit your application to be listed in the Azure AD App Gallery, so it's not only easier for your customers to find, it's easier for them to onboard going through the wizard-driven process. And also look at exploring which ways to enrich your application with the Microsoft Graph Explorer. So how can you get started? Well, we have a number of great resources available for you. The links are on here, and I'll also be putting them in the comments as well. But you can find us on GitHub, Stack Overflow, User Voice, Twitter, and more. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to attend this session. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or my team.